She spent her last $30 on 39 sick, half-dead geese, and the whole town said she'd lost her mind. It was 1891, Kansas Prairie, the kind of place that swallowed widows whole and didn't bother apologizing. Evelyn Mercer had 11 acres of cracked earth, a leaking roof, and neighbors who were already placing bets on how long before she packed up and disappeared. Instead of buying a guard dog or fixing her fences, she brought home a wagon full of birds nobody wanted. They called her crazy. They laughed loud enough for her to hear. They had no idea what those geese were about to do. If you want to find out how one widow and 39 unwanted birds changed an entire frontier, hit that like button, drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels, and don't you dare leave before the end. The wagon wheels hit every rut on the road back from Colby, and Evelyn Mercer didn't slow down for any of them. She sat straight on the buckboard, reins loose in her hands, jaw set the way it always was when she'd made a decision she knew other people wouldn't understand. The afternoon light was going amber and flat across the prairie, the kind of light that made everything look further away than it actually was. Behind her, in the bed of the wagon, 39 geese shifted and complained against the wooden slats of the borrowed crates she'd loaded them into. They smelled. They were loud. 3 of them were missing patches of feathers, and at least 2 had eyes so crusted over she wasn't sure yet whether they could see properly. She'd paid $7.50 for the lot of them. $7.50 that she did not have to spare. The man who sold them to her, old Porter Deacons, who ran a small operation of mixed livestock outside Colby, had looked at her like she'd said something in a foreign language when she made the offer. He'd been about to put them down. The whole flock had come through some kind of respiratory sickness that had swept the county in late summer, and he'd lost patience with nursing birds that didn't look like they were going to pull through. Half his healthy stock had been sold off to pay debts. These 39, the stragglers, the ones still wheezing and half limp, he'd been planning on ending the problem that afternoon. "You sure about this?" he'd asked. "I'm sure," she'd said. He'd taken her money without another word, though she'd caught him watching her load the crates with an expression she recognized well. It was the look people gave a woman who was making a mistake they'd already decided not to warn her about, because the warning would require more investment in her outcome than they were willing to give. She'd gotten that look a lot since Daniel died. Daniel Mercer had been dead for 14 months by then. Kicked by a horse on a Tuesday morning in September of 1890, dead by Thursday evening, buried in the low ground north of the claim before the week was out. They'd been married 6 years. They had no children, something Evelyn had stopped grieving about around year 3, when it became clear that surviving the Kansas winters was difficult enough without adding that particular weight. Daniel had been a decent man in the ways that counted. He didn't drink to excess, he didn't raise his hand, and he worked the land with a kind of stubborn optimism that Evelyn had found genuinely admirable even when the crops failed and the bills stacked up. What he had not been was practical about money. The 11 acres he'd bought with borrowed capital from Calvin Dorsey's lending operation were mortgaged against a repayment schedule that assumed better yields than the land had ever produced. When Evelyn went through the books after the funeral, sitting at the kitchen table by lamplight with Daniel's handwriting blurring in front of her eyes, she'd found the full picture. The farm was not just struggling, it was drowning in small amounts, the worst kind of drowning, slow enough that you kept thinking you might still get your head above water. She owed Dorsey a note payment in March, another in September. She had, at the time of Daniel's death, $22 in cash and an inventory that included 1 elderly plow horse named Biscuit, a kitchen garden that produced irregularly, a hen house with 11 laying hens, and 11 acres of Kansas prairie that had never once in 6 years yielded what it had promised. The neighbors had been sympathetic for about 3 weeks. After that, sympathy curdled into the particular awkwardness people feel around someone else's misfortune when it goes on longer than is comfortable to witness. The Harkins family to the east, Tom and Ruth Harkins, with their 4 children and their proper-sized farm operation and their well that never ran dry, had brought food twice in the first month. Ruth had patted Evelyn's hand and said if there was anything they could do. Tom had looked at the fence line with an expression that suggested he was calculating the acreage. The Caldwells to the west were Paul lighter in their distance. Agnes Caldwell was a woman of firm opinions and a strong sense of propriety, which in her case translated into a belief that a widow alone on a claim was either temporary or a problem. She'd offered, twice, to write to her cousin in Topeka who ran a boarding house. Each time Evelyn had thanked her and said she was staying put. Agnes hadn't offered again. Proud. The gossip about the geese started before Evelyn even got them home. Porter Deakins had a son-in-law who worked at the feed store in Harlan County, and word moved faster than wagons out on the prairie. By the time Evelyn pulled up to her own gate and started unloading crates, Ruth Harkins had already appeared at the fence line with her arms crossed, and an expression that walked the careful line between concern and judgment. "Evelyn?" Ruth's voice carried the careful tone of a woman who'd rehearsed the conversation. "Those are geese." "They are," Evelyn agreed, lifting the first crate. "You bought geese." 39 of them." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Evelyn could hear her breathing through her nose, which Ruth did when she was trying to formulate a response that was charitable enough to feel good about later. "Porter Deacon's sick birds." "They're not all sick. Some of them are just undernourished." "Evelyn." Ruth's voice dropped to the register she used when she was about to say something she meant to be kind. "Everyone knows it's been a hard year and nobody's judging, but a guard dog. You could have bought a decent dog for that money, or fixed the south fence. Tom said just last week your south fence was—" "My south fence is my concern." Ruth stopped. "Ruth." Evelyn set down the crate, straightened up, and looked at her neighbor with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was also entirely finished with the direction of the conversation. "I appreciate you coming over, Ruth. I'll have you in for coffee once I get these settled." Ruth left without the coffee invitation being extended further. By evening, Evelyn was reasonably certain the entire county knew about the geese. The first 2 weeks were genuinely difficult. 3 of the birds were sicker than she'd understood, and she lost them in the first week despite the grain mash she'd prepared and the careful management of their shelter in the old lean-to beside the main house. She'd converted it quickly, patching the gaps in the walls and laying fresh straw and making sure the floor stayed dry, which required more attention than she'd anticipated given that geese produce more mess per bird than she'd accounted for. She had no formal knowledge of geese. What she had was observation. She watched them the way she'd watched everything on the farm, with the particular attention of someone who understood that her survival was in the details. She noticed which birds were the most alert, which ones picked at their food without appetite, which ones pressed close together in a way that suggested cold or sickness rather than simple flocking instinct. She learned the sounds, the low throaty murmur that meant contentment, the sharp chatter that meant mild agitation, the full-throated honking that meant, well, she wasn't sure yet what the full-throated honking meant, because so far it had meant her arrival with the grain bucket and also a piece of fence post that had fallen over. She was still learning the vocabulary. It was the 4th week before she got her first real education. She'd been in the kitchen well after dark, working on the accounts by lamplight and trying to find a number that made the March payment look survivable. She hadn't found it. The geese were quiet, that low murmur she'd come to associate with them settling for the night, and then between one moment and the next, they weren't. The noise hit the house like a physical thing, all of them, every bird, in a sound she hadn't heard before. Not the farm arrival chatter, not the agitated complaints about the rain, but something urgent and directional. The honking layered and overlapping in a way that made her stomach do something she didn't entirely expect. She was out the door with the shotgun before she'd consciously decided to move. She found the coyote at the edge of the hen house. It hadn't gotten in yet. The door was latched properly, but it had been working the corner of the fence in a way that suggested time and patience. Evelyn fired once into the air. The coyote was gone before the sound finished echoing. She stood in the dark for a moment after, the shotgun still warm in her hands, listening to the geese settle back into their low murmur. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table for a while before she went back to the accounts. The boy appeared in the 3rd week of October. He'd been watching from the fence line for several days before she acknowledged him. She'd seen him the second morning, a slight figure with a serious face who stood with his elbows on the top rail and observed the geese with the focused attention of someone taking notes. He was maybe 11 or 12, brown from the sun, and dressed in clothes that were clean, but had been mended more times than they could comfortably absorb. She recognized him eventually as Noah Whitlock, whose family ran a claim about 2 miles north. She knew his father in the way she knew most people here, by sight, by reputation, by the shape of his hardship. She left him alone at the fence for 3 days. On the fourth morning, she brought 2 cups of coffee to the fence line. He looked startled when she held one out to him. "You don't have to keep watching from over there," she said. His name was Noah, he confirmed, and he was 12, and he'd never seen geese that acted like that before. "They know things," he said, with the seriousness of a person stating an observable fact rather than offering an opinion. "What kind of things?" He thought about it. "My pa's dog, she barks at plenty of things. Barks at the wind sometimes. Barks when she's bored." He looked at the flock, who were making their morning rounds of the perimeter. "These ones don't do that. They're quiet a lot. But when they make noise—" He paused. "It means something." Evelyn studied him. "You've been watching them every morning." "I've been watching them every morning," he agreed, without any apparent embarrassment about it. "Come inside the fence if you want to see them properly. Just move slow and don't run." He was careful and patient, which she appreciated. He watched the birds with genuine attention, not the kind of attention children usually gave animals, performance attention, designed for adult approval, but the quiet, steady kind that actually processed information. He noticed things she hadn't fully articulated yet. He pointed out that the 2 large ganders always positioned themselves on opposite sides of the flock when it moved, like flankers. He noticed that a particular goose, a heavy female with a slightly crooked neck from an old injury, seemed to be the first one to respond to anything, before the ganders, before any of the others. "She's the one that knows first," Noah said. Evelyn looked at the bird with the crooked neck, who was currently watching something in the grass at the western edge of the yard with extreme stillness. "What do you think she's looking at?" "I don't know, but I'd wait and see." 3 minutes later, a fox slipped out of the tall grass at the western edge. The crooked-necked goose erupted into alarm, and the rest of the flock followed in a wall of sound. Evelyn watched Noah's face while the noise crashed around them. He looked calm. He looked, actually, like he'd expected it. "Come back tomorrow," she said. "I'll show you the feeding pattern." The thing about ridicule is that it needs maintenance. People who'd laughed at the geese in October expected to still be laughing in November, but by November the evidence was getting difficult to joke around. Evelyn's kitchen garden, which had been failing for 2 years, which everyone had quietly understood to be failing, was producing in a way that didn't make sense against the math of the season. Her crop rows were clean. Not just the obvious weeds pulled, but the soil itself looked different, darker, worked. She'd let the geese range across the garden during the day, directing them with Noah's help, and they'd done what geese do. They ate every insect they could find. Aphids, beetles, grubs. The flock moved through the rows with methodical appetite, and the plants responded to the absence of the things destroying them. Tom Harkins came to look at her corn rows in the first week of November, and she watched him do the arithmetic of someone confronted with something they'd expected to fail that hadn't failed. "What'd you do different?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Let the geese work the rows 3 times a week." He was quiet for a while. His own crop rows were visible from here, and they were not in comparable shape. He said finally. He left, and Evelyn had a feeling he was going home to think about it, which was fine. Thinking was free. What was not fine was Calvin Dorsey. Motets. Calvin Dorsey's operation in Harlan County was built on the kind of structure that required other people's difficulties to stay profitable. He ran a lending service, mortgage notes and emergency loans at terms that were legal, but barely. And he ran the only proper general store for 20 miles. And he had an arrangement with the county assessor that was never openly discussed, but was commonly understood. He was not a man who did obviously cruel things. He was a man who arranged circumstances carefully and waited for circumstances to do the work. He'd held Daniel Mercer's notes for 6 years. He'd extended terms twice, always with adjustments that looked like generosity and functioned as longer chains. When he heard about the geese, the story had gotten to him embellished, the way stories did, 39 sick birds becoming 60 diseased animals that a crazy widow was keeping in her kitchen. He'd dismissed it. By the time the story corrected itself to something closer to the truth, the dismissal had become something else. Evelyn Mercer, the gossip lines told him, was making her farm work, not just surviving, making it work. Her garden output for the fall had been better than it had any right to be. She was talking to neighbors, teaching Noah Whitlock's boy. The Brennan family, 2 claims to the north, had come to look at the flock. He drove out himself in the 3rd week of November on the pretext of checking a nearby property. He pulled up at her gate and sat in his buggy, watching the geese work the yard, watching the way the 2 ganders stood sentinel at the corners, watching the crooked-neck female move along the fence line with her peculiar alert stillness. He stayed for about 10 minutes. He left without stopping to speak. That evening, he had a long conversation with Gerald Fitch, who served on the Harlan County Township Council and owed Calvin Dorsey $200. The first Evelyn heard of it was from Ruth Harkins, who came to the fence line on a Tuesday morning in early December with an expression that was genuinely troubled rather than the comfortable trouble of someone delivering interesting bad news. "Calvin Dorsey has been talking to Gerald Fitch," Ruth said without preamble, "and Gerald Fitch has been talking to the others on the council." Evelyn was mending a section of fence. She didn't stop. "Talking about what?" "There's an ordinance from, I don't know, from years ago," Tom looked it up. "Something about livestock within a certain distance of neighboring claims, if those claims file a complaint. About noise, nuisance, and sanitation." Evelyn straightened up slowly. "Who's filing a complaint?" Ruth had the grace to look embarrassed. "I don't know who's filing it formally, but Calvin Dorsey is telling people that the geese are... He says there have been reports of... There have been no reports," Evelyn said. "The people near me have no complaint." "I know that." "Does Gerald Fitch know that?" Ruth was quiet. The fence wire was still in Evelyn's hands. She set it down carefully. The geese were doing their morning rounds 30 yards away, the low murmur of a flock that had nothing currently to be alarmed about. Evelyn watched them for a moment. "When's the council meeting?" she said. "First week of January." She nodded once. Ruth reached across the fence and touched her arm, which Ruth almost never did. "I'm sorry, Evelyn. Tom says it might be hard to fight it if Dorsey's already talked to enough of them." "Maybe," Evelyn said. "I appreciate you telling me." She picked the fence wire back up and went back to work. December hit the prairie hard that year. A cold front came through in the 2nd week that dropped the temperature fast enough to split fence posts, and Evelyn spent 3 days in a constant cycle of breaking ice from the water troughs, hauling extra straw to the geese's shelter, and keeping the stove fed. Noah came every day that he could, which was most days. His own family's claim had its own winter demands, but the boy seemed to find a way to appear at her fence line most mornings regardless, his breath fogging the air, his hands already reaching for whatever tool or task needed doing. She didn't ask him about his home situation directly. She had a sense of it from what he didn't say. The Whitlock place had been through hard seasons and harder luck, and Noah's father was a man who drank thoughtfully rather than violently, which was perhaps the most generous way to describe someone who drank too much. Noah had a younger sister, he'd mentioned once, and a mother who kept chickens and kept the family ledger and kept everything together with the particular exhausted competence of a woman who'd stopped expecting help from a particular direction and had reorganized her expectations accordingly. The boy learned fast, faster than fast. He'd internalized the flock's vocabulary in a way that Evelyn found genuinely remarkable. He could identify the crooked-neck female's different calls with accuracy that took Evelyn a moment to verify. He knew the difference between the low warning chatter and the escalating alarm. He'd developed a system of his own observation, a kind of log he kept in a small notebook. Not assigned, not suggested, just something he'd started doing, noting the weather and time of day and what had preceded each alarm response. "You're keeping records," she said, when she saw the notebook the first time. "It helps me see the patterns," he said, in the tone of someone who'd been told once that seeing patterns in things was odd and had decided not to care. "It does help," she agreed. "What patterns are you seeing?" He opened the notebook. He'd noted that the crooked-neck female, he'd named her Millicent, which Evelyn hadn't argued with, was most active and alert in the hour before dusk. He'd noted that the flock as a whole was more reactive in still air than in wind, which he thought might be because in still air the smell carried further. He'd noted that when both ganders positioned themselves on the same side of the flock instead of opposite sides, something had spooked them from that direction, and they were orienting toward it. Evelyn read through the notes in the cold December light. "This is good work," she said. Noah looked at the notebook rather than at her. "I just wrote down what I saw." "That's what good work is." Christmas passed quietly. Evelyn cooked a small meal and sat with it alone at the kitchen table, which she'd done last year too and had decided in advance not to make miserable by thinking about too hard. She thought about it anyway, some. She thought about Daniel, who had been good company at the table and had always found something to say about anything. She thought about the council meeting in January. She thought about the note payment in March. She did not think about what she would do if the council voted to remove the flock, because she had decided not to think about that until she had to. The geese spent Christmas the way they spent every day, working the perimeter, watching the grass, murmuring among themselves in the language she was still learning. Millicent stood at the south fence with her crooked neck tilted at the particular angle that meant she was tracking something, and Evelyn stood at the kitchen window watching her for a while, and the cold light fell across the yard, and the prairie was so quiet she could hear the wind in the grass half a mile away. She poured herself a second cup of coffee and went back to the account books. The numbers didn't get better, but they didn't get worse, and on the Kansas prairie in the winter of 1891, that was something. And 3 days before the new year, the first neighbor came to her door directly. Hazel Brennan was a woman Evelyn knew by acquaintance rather than friendship. A practical-minded woman in her 40s whose husband had died 4 years earlier and who'd kept the claim going through a combination of stubbornness and careful management. She showed up at Evelyn's door in the late morning with a jar of preserved plums, which was the prairie equivalent of a formal introduction. Evelyn made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table. "I heard about the council vote," Hazel said, getting to it with the directness of someone who didn't have time for extended approaches. "The geese. Word gets around. Calvin Dorsey's been working on this for 6 weeks, from what I can tell." Hazel set her coffee cup down. "You know why?" "I have a theory." "Your theory is right." Hazel looked at her steadily. "You're making your place work, not just surviving, but working. And you're talking to people, teaching the Whitlock boy. The Brennan claim. My eldest asked me last week if we could get geese." A dry pause. "I told him we'd wait and see." "Wait and see what?" "Whether you're still here in February." Hazel said it without cruelty, just flat assessment, the way you talked about weather or soil quality. "If Dorsey gets that ordinance passed, you lose the flock. You lose the flock, you lose the garden production. You lose the garden production." She didn't finish it. "I know the sequence," Evelyn said. "I'll come to the council meeting," Hazel said, "and I'll bring who I can. But Evelyn," she paused, "you need more than farmers saying you're a good neighbor. You need Dorsey to have done something they can see." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Through the window, she could see the flock moving in their steady morning pattern. Millicent at the front, the ganders at the flanks. "He's already done it," she said. "He's been doing it. The question is whether anyone's paying attention." Hazel looked at her for a moment. "Then make sure they are," she said. She left the jar of plums on the table. Evelyn stood at the window after she left and watched the geese until the afternoon light started to change. And she thought about the council meeting, and she thought about what Hazel had said, and she thought about the way Millicent tilted her head at the south fence when she was tracking something that hadn't arrived yet. The geese knew things before they happened. The question was whether the people of Harlan County were willing to listen to what the geese were saying, or whether they'd decided already that the sound of them was just noise. The new year was 4 days out. The council vote was 8 days after that. And somewhere in the tall grass to the west, something was moving that Evelyn couldn't see yet. Millicent had been watching it for 3 days. The new year came in cold and without ceremony. Evelyn woke on January 1st to a sky the color of old pewter and a wind that had teeth in it, and she lay in bed for exactly as long as it took to remember what the month held before she got up and started the stove. The council meeting was 11 days out. She had 11 days to figure out what Hazel Brennan had meant by "make sure they are paying attention," which sounded clear enough when someone else said it and was considerably murkier when you were the one who had to do the actual work of it. She pulled on her coat and went out to check the flock. The geese were already moving, not their alarm movement, just the morning routine, the slow perimeter walk that she'd come to think of as their version of taking inventory. Millicent was at the south fence, same as yesterday, same as the day before. Her crooked neck was tilted at the angle that meant she was tracking something, but it was the patient tilt, not the urgent one. Whatever was out there in the grass, it was far enough away that she was content to watch rather than sound. Evelyn stood at the fence for a while, her breath fogging, and watched the bird watch the horizon. I see you, she said, to Millicent or to whatever was in the grass. She wasn't entirely sure which. Noah arrived before 8, which was earlier than usual, and suggested he'd left the house in a hurry. He was wearing a coat that was too thin for the temperature and carrying his notebook, and he had the look of someone who'd been thinking about something since before dawn. I heard my father talking last night, he said, without preamble, coming through the gate with the practiced ease of someone who'd stopped asking permission weeks ago. About the council meeting. About your geese. Evelyn handed him a pair of work gloves. What'd he say? Noah pulled the gloves on and didn't quite meet her eyes. He said Calvin Dorsey came to the store in Colby 2 days ago and was talking to some of the men there, saying the geese were a health problem, that they'd been causing trouble with neighboring livestock. He stopped. We don't have any trouble with your geese. Neither does anyone near you. I don't know who he's been talking to. He doesn't need people who have actual complaints, Evelyn said. He needs people who'll say what he needs said. Those are different things. Noah was quiet for a moment, processing that. He was 12, but he was the kind of 12 that had been paying attention to how adults operated for long enough that he'd stopped being surprised by it and had started just cataloging it. So he's making things up. He's arranging things. There's a difference. What's the difference? Evelyn considered. Making things up is when you say something that isn't true. Arranging things is when you find the pieces of things that are technically true and put them together in an order that creates an impression that isn't. She paused. Your geese make noise. True. Noise can disturb neighbors. True. Therefore, the geese are a disturbance to neighbors. That's the arrangement. Noah opened his notebook to a fresh page and wrote something in it. Evelyn glanced over and saw he'd written, arranging things, technically true, wrong impression. She didn't say anything about it. She handed him the grain bucket instead. Fun. Over the next 4 days, she paid calls. Not dramatic calls. Not the kind where you showed up and made your case and asked for support. Just visits, coffee and conversation, the currency of the prairie, which moved slower than money but stuck longer. She went to Hazel Brennan's first, then the Caldwell place, then 2 claims further north where families she knew less well were wintering. She didn't talk about the council meeting unless they brought it up. She talked about the season, about what the flock had been doing, about Noah's notebook, and the patterns he'd been finding. At the Caldwell place, Agnes, who had never been a particular ally and had the social caution of someone who didn't like to be on a losing side, had asked more questions than Evelyn expected. About the geese's alarm behavior, about the coyote in October, about what exactly the crooked-neck female had been watching at the south fence. 3 days, Evelyn said. She's been watching something at the south fence for 3 days. And she hasn't alarmed. Not the full alarm, the watching posture. Agnes was quiet for a moment. She was a woman who kept her own counsel, and her face didn't give much away, but Evelyn had the sense of something being weighed. Calvin Dorsey bought Gerald Fitch's debt last spring, Agnes said, abruptly and apparently from nowhere. Did you know that? Evelyn hadn't known that specifically, though she'd understood the shape of it. I knew Fitch owed him. He bought it from the original creditor, which means Fitch owes him directly now. Agnes looked at her teacup. Gerald Fitch is not a dishonest man. He is a man in a difficult position, and difficult positions make people flexible in their principles. She set the cup down. I'm telling you this because you should know which way the wind is blowing before you walk into that room. I appreciate that. I'm not promising anything, Agnes said quickly. I want to be clear about that. I'm not promising I'll be there or that I'll say anything. I'm just telling you what I know. Understood. Agnes refilled her tea without offering more on the subject, and they talked about the weather for another 20 minutes, and Evelyn went home with the sense that Agnes Caldwell was going to be at that meeting and was going to say something, but that she'd needed to preserve some private fiction about not having decided yet. People needed room to come to things in their own way. Evelyn had learned that. On the 5th of January, 3 days before the council meeting, the South Fence situation resolved itself. She'd been in the henhouse doing the morning check when the geese erupted. Not the full alarm, not the wall of sound she'd heard in October, but an escalating chatter that had urgency in it without the full panic register. Millicent's voice was distinct in the middle of it, the slightly higher pitch she used when she'd gone from watching to reacting. Evelyn came out of the hen house fast with the shotgun already in her hand. She'd taken to keeping it near since the coyote, and found Noah at the south fence, completely still, his notebook in one hand and his arm extended with the other, pointing at something in the long grass about 40 yards out. She came up beside him and looked where he was pointing. 2 men. Not locals. She didn't know their faces, and she knew most faces in a 20-mile radius. They were lying in the grass at the edge of her property, and they had the particular stillness of people who'd been caught and were calculating their options. One of them had a sack that he was not making any move to show her the contents of. The geese were still going. Millicent was at the fence line between them and the men, and her alarm had a different quality to it than the coyote alarm. More sustained, more directed. "Get up," Evelyn said, loudly enough to carry. The 2 men looked at each other. "I said get up, both of you. Slow." They got up slow. The one with the sack kept it behind him, which told her something about what was in it. They were maybe 30 and 35, both of them with the look of men who moved around a lot and didn't stay anywhere long. Not necessarily criminal, but the kind of people who operated in the spaces between established things. "This is private land," Evelyn said. "You're on the wrong side of my fence." "We were just passing through," the older one said. His voice was flat and had a conciliatory quality that wasn't quite convincing. "No harm meant." "What's in the sack?" A pause. "Tools." "What kind of tools?" Another pause, longer. The geese were still going, though Millicent had dropped to a slightly lower register, now that the men were visible and stationary rather than hidden and moving. "Wire cutters," the younger one said, "and some other things." The older one shot him a look that suggested this was more candor than he'd been advised to offer. Evelyn held the shotgun in a way that communicated that she knew what she was doing with it and that it was loaded. "There are 2 farms in that direction that are unoccupied this week," she said. "The Pratt claim and the old Hollis place, both of which have harvest stores that haven't been moved yet." Nobody said anything. "You'll get off my property now," Evelyn said, "and you'll go back the direction you came from. And if I see either of you on this road again, I will send word to the county sheriff before you get to the next gate." They went. Not fast, fast would have conceded too much. But they went, and she watched them until they were over the rise and out of sight. She stood there for a while after, her heart doing something more active than she would have liked to admit, the shotgun still in her hands. Noah was still standing beside her. He hadn't moved since she'd arrived. 3 days, she said quietly. She'd been watching them for 3 days. Noah looked at Millicent, who had stopped alarming and was doing a victory circuit of the fence line in the particular way that suggested self-satisfaction. He opened his notebook and wrote the date and time and a careful description of what had just happened. "I'm going to the sheriff," Evelyn said, "about those men. About those men and about the Pratt claim and about the Hollis place." She paused. "And you're coming with me, because you're a witness and your notebook is evidence." Noah closed the notebook carefully. "My father's going to want to know where I went." "Tell him you were helping document a potential theft deterrence event." She looked at him. "Or tell him you helped stop a robbery. Either works." Something shifted in Noah's face. Not quite a smile, not quite pride, but something in between that was more real than either. He pocketed the notebook. "I'll go tell my mother where I'll be," he said. "She'll want to know." "What?" The sheriff of Harlan County was a man named Dale Atchison, who had been doing the job for 9 years and had the temperament of someone who'd heard most stories already and was waiting to be surprised. He heard Evelyn's account in his office, with his hands folded on the desk, asked 3 specific questions about the men's descriptions, asked 2 more about the wire cutters, and then sat back and looked at her in a way that suggested he was reassessing something. "You say your geese tracked them for 3 days before they made a move," he said. "Before they made their approach, yes. Millicent, the lead female, had been watching the south fence since the 2nd of January. Millicent," he repeated in a tone that was carefully neutral. "The bird with the crooked neck. She responds first, before the flock." He looked at Noah, who had his notebook open on his knee and was ready to show the relevant pages. Atchison leaned over and read the entries for January 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th, with the expression of a man reading something unexpected. "This is your record," he said to Noah. "Yes, sir. I've been keeping notes on the flock since October." "And you've been, studying them?" "Yes, sir." Noah said it without apology. Atchison sat back again, He looked at the ceiling for a moment. "I'll go out to the Pratt claim in the Hollis place this afternoon," he said. "Check for any signs that someone had been casing the properties." He looked at Evelyn. "This is useful information, Mrs. Mercer. I won't say it surprises me about the two men. There's been a pattern of theft in this county for most of the fall that I've been trying to get ahead of. But it does refine my thinking." He did not mention Calvin Dorsey or the council meeting. Neither did she. But as she and Noah left his office, she had the feeling that Dale Atchison was a man who kept his own records, and that she'd just handed him a piece of something he'd been looking for. The news about the two men at the fence moved through the county faster than she could have managed deliberately. By the next morning, Tom Harkins had come to the fence, and this time he wasn't doing any arithmetic about acreage. He was standing with his hat in his hand, which was Tom's version of an apology posture, and he got about halfway through a sentence about Ruth having heard from Agnes Caldwell, who had heard from someone in town before Evelyn interrupted him. "Tom, what do you need?" He cleared his throat. "I want to understand better what you're doing with the geese, the way they track things. Come inside the fence, move slow, and don't run." He came inside the fence, and she walked him through what she knew, which by now was considerable. She showed him how the flock moved in formation when it sensed something, how the ganders flanked, how Millicent positioned herself relative to whatever she was tracking. Tom watched with an expression that moved through several phases. Skepticism to attention to something reluctant and uncomfortable that was probably the sensation of having been wrong about something for several months. "I told Ruth you were being impractical," he said after a while. "I know. I said it to her face and probably to other people." He was looking at Millicent, not at Evelyn. "A dog is a proven thing. A dog, everyone understands. What you were doing seemed like something a person did when they were—" He stopped. "Desperate," Evelyn said. "I was going to say not thinking clearly." "Same thing, from where you were standing." He turned and looked at her directly, which took some effort. She could see it costing him something. "I won't be saying anything at the council meeting that supports Dorsey's ordinance." "I appreciate that. Ruth will be there too, and I'll ask around." He put his hat back on. "I'm not promising you it'll be enough. Dorsey's had weeks on this." "I know that too." He left, and she stood in the yard with the flock moving around her, and she thought about all the things that Tom Harkins had not quite said and had said anyway, and she thought it was strange how people needed to be in the right sequence of small embarrassments before they could do the obvious thing. The evening of January 7th, the night before the meeting, she was in the kitchen with her boots off and a pot of beans on the stove and Noah's notebook open on the table. She'd asked him to leave it with her for the night, and he'd handed it over without asking why. She was reading back through the entries from October, the first ones, when the observations were still tentative and the handwriting slightly larger, less confident. Millicent responds first. Ganders flank. Flock quiet in wind. And then the later entries, more detailed, more certain. The handwriting tighter as he'd settled into the work. She'd been thinking about what to say at the council meeting. She was not a natural speaker in public settings. She was a woman who thought well and felt the right words come to her about 30 minutes after any given conversation, when she was alone and too late to say them. She'd been running through different versions of the thing in her head for days, and none of them felt like the right approach. Hazel Brennan had said, "Make sure they're paying attention." She sat with that for a while. The beans were simmering. The wind had come up outside, which meant the geese were doing their low murmur, less reactive in the wind, Noah's notebook said. Evelyn read that entry again and thought about how a 12-year-old boy with a notebook had done more careful, honest observation of something real than a county merchant with 30 years of standing had done in the same period. She closed the notebook. She'd been thinking about this wrong. She'd been trying to figure out what to say to make the council believe her. But the point wasn't what she said. The point was what the flock had already done, and whether the people in that room could be made to see it. She pulled a piece of paper toward her and started writing. Not a speech, just a list. October, the coyote. November, the garden production. December, the cold front and the sustained watch. January 5th, the two men at the south fence. Dale Atchison's visit to the Pratt claim, where he'd found signs that someone had been watching the property for at least several days. Each entry was specific, dates, details. Noah's notebook entries by page number. She was still writing at 10 o'clock when the beans were ready. She ate standing at the counter, reading back over what she'd written. It was not a speech, it was evidence. Evidence was different from argument. Evidence didn't ask people to believe anything, it just laid things down and let people see them. She washed the bowl, banked the stove, and went to bed. Outside, the geese were quiet. The wind moved through the grass with its particular whisper. Millicent stood at the south fence in the dark, her crooked neck tilted, watching the night with her patient, relentless attention. The meeting was tomorrow. And Calvin Dorsey, for all his weeks of careful arrangement, had not accounted for the fact that Evelyn Mercer had been doing the same thing he'd been doing, building a case, piece by piece, in a county that was watching both of them work. The council meeting was held in the back room of Colby's general store. Not Dorsey's store, which was 20 miles further east, but the smaller operation run by a man named Pete Garland, who had no particular stake in the outcome and had offered the space because the township had no dedicated building for such things. Evelyn arrived early. She hadn't intended to arrive early. She'd intended to arrive at a reasonable time, composed, with her list in her coat pocket and her boots properly cleaned. But the wagon had moved faster than she'd planned, and she found herself at the hitching post outside Garland's store with 20 minutes to spare and nothing to do with them. She tied Biscuit to the rail and stood on the board sidewalk in the January cold and watched the street. People were already coming. More than she'd expected, which was either a good sign or a bad one depending on who was in the room when the vote happened. She recognized faces. The Harkins wagon, Tom driving with Ruth beside him, both of them in their good coats. Hazel Brennan on horseback, alone, moving with the purposeful economy of a woman who didn't waste motion. Two families she knew from the northern claims, the Dunns and the Pelletiers, who she hadn't specifically talked to, but who had apparently heard enough to feel the meeting was worth the ride. She also saw Gerald Fitch arrive, which she'd expected, and she saw the two men Fitch brought with him, who she recognized as regular customers at Dorsey's store and whose presence told her something about how the support had been assembled. Calvin Dorsey himself did not arrive until everyone else was seated. That was its own kind of statement. The room held about 30 people by the time Pete Garland closed the side door against the cold. It smelled of wood smoke and damp wool, and the particular close-quarters tension of a group of people who knew each other and were not entirely sure which side of something they were on. 2 oil lamps hung from the ceiling. The council, 5 men, Gerald Fitch at the center, sat at a long table at one end of the room. The rest of the people stood or sat on the benches that had been brought in for the occasion. Evelyn stood along the right wall. Noah was not here. His mother had decided 12 was too young for a county council meeting, which Evelyn respected. But he'd insisted she take the notebook, and she had it in her coat pocket beside her list. Dorsey was near the back, positioned where he could see everyone without being the most visible person in the room. He was dressed well, as he always was, and he had the settled composure of someone who'd done the work ahead of time and was now simply waiting for the process to confirm it. He did not look at Evelyn when he entered. That was also its own kind of statement. Gerald Fitch opened the meeting by reading the ordinance language, which took longer than necessary, and which nobody listened to very carefully because everyone already knew what it said. It was old livestock law, provisions written for different circumstances, being applied here through a particular reading that required goodwill toward the application and a willingness not to examine it too closely. When Fitch finished reading, he asked if anyone had opening remarks. One of the men Fitch had brought, a heavy-set farmer named Coulter, who ran a claim east of Dorsey's store, stood up and said that the geese were a known nuisance, that he'd personally been disturbed by the noise on multiple occasions, and that the sanitation concerns were self-evident to anyone who'd been near a large goose operation. He sat down. Evelyn noted that Coulter's claim was 16 miles from her property. Another man said something about property values that was vague enough to mean nothing specific and everything general. Then Hazel Brennan stood up. "I'd like to hear from Mrs. Mercer," Hazel said. She didn't ask it as a question. She said it the way someone states a procedural expectation, as if it were already decided. Several people in the room shifted slightly in the way people shift when something they were worried might not happen looks like it's going to happen after all. Fitch looked at Dorsey, which was a mistake. A small mistake, over fast, but Evelyn saw it, and she was not the only one. He looked back at the room. Mrs. Mercer, you have the floor. Some. She told herself she wasn't going to make a speech. She didn't make a speech. She pulled the list from her pocket and she read it. Dates, events, specific details. The coyote in October. The two men at the south fence, January 5th. Here she held up Noah's notebook and read the relevant entries aloud. The boy's handwriting turned into her voice. The careful observations of a 12-year-old who'd been paying attention when most adults weren't. She mentioned Dale Atchison's visit to the Pratt claim and what he'd found there. She did not say my geese protected this community. She read the dates and let the room do the arithmetic. When she finished, she folded the list and put it back in her pocket and said, "That's what I have," and sat down. There was a silence in the room that had a different quality than the silence before she'd spoken. Tom Harkins stood up next. He didn't have a list. He just said what he'd seen: the garden production, the fence line management, the way the flock had behaved through the December cold front. He said it plainly, without decoration, in the voice of a man who farmed the land next door and had no reason to say things that weren't accurate. Then he said, "I was one of the people who told my wife this woman had lost her mind when she bought those birds." A pause. "I was wrong. I'm saying that here because it's the truth, and because I think the truth is relevant to what you're deciding." He sat down. Ruth, beside him, did not touch his arm or make any kind of gesture that suggested she'd been waiting for this. She just looked straight ahead, but her posture had a quality that was very close to quiet satisfaction. Agnes Caldwell spoke. She had not told Evelyn she would speak, and she did not look at Evelyn when she rose. She addressed the council directly and said that the ordinance as proposed was being applied to a situation it was not designed for, and that the complaint had originated not from neighbors. She was very precise about this, not from neighbors, but from a party whose financial interest in the matter was a matter of public record. She did not say Calvin Dorsey's name. She didn't need to. Everyone in the room knew his name and could apply it themselves. Fitch's face had gone through 2 changes in the last 5 minutes. He was looking at the table now. Dorsey stood up. He had the voice of a man accustomed to being listened to. Not loud, not performative, but with the steady confidence of someone who'd been the most important person in many rooms and had stopped noticing it. He said that the issue was not personal. He said it was about community standards. He said that the county could not allow individual interest to override the common good, and that the law was clear on the matter of livestock management. He was good at it. Evelyn watched the room while he spoke, and she could see it working on some people. The careful reasonableness, the appeal to common standards, the way he made it sound like principle rather than motive. 3 or 4 faces showed the uncomfortable look of people who'd mostly made up their minds but were now having second thoughts. Then Dale Atchison walked in. He'd been standing outside the door. She hadn't known that, hadn't arranged it. And he came in with the quiet authority of his office and stood at the back of the room and waited for Dorsey to finish. Dorsey saw him and finished slightly faster than he might have otherwise. "I have some information that's relevant," Atchison said from the back of the room, "if the council's willing to hear it." Fitch said they were willing. Atchison was brief and specific. The 2 men at Evelyn's fence on January 5th had been identified. They were the same 2 men connected to a string of farm thefts across 2 counties going back to September. The Pratt claim and the Hollis place had both shown evidence of prior surveillance. The Geese, he said it plainly, without editorial, had been tracking those men for 3 days before they made their approach, and had raised the alarm that morning in time for Mrs. Mercer to intercept them before they got to either of the unoccupied properties. He said, "I'm not here to tell the council how to vote. I'm here because I think the complete picture is relevant to the decision." He stepped back. The room was very quiet. Then someone Evelyn didn't know very well. A farmer named Olson from the northern edge of the county, a quiet man who she'd seen at the store twice and never spoken to, said, "I had tools stolen off my property in October. Wire cutters, a good saw, grain sacking. Sheriff's been looking for whoever did it." He wasn't asking a question. He was adding a piece. Another voice from the left side of the room. "Same thing happened to the Pelletiers in November. They never found who did it." The room was shifting. Not dramatically. Not the way it happened in stories, where one moment changed everything and everyone turned together. It was slower than that, more uncomfortable, The particular movement of a group of people who'd been standing in a position for a while and were now finding it less comfortable than it had seemed when they first took it. Dorsey was still standing. He tried once more. He said the theft issue was separate from the ordnance issue, and that mixing them was a confusion of different matters. Nobody in the room looked like they found this convincing. Fitch called for the vote. It failed. 3-2, the ordinance did not pass. Fitch himself voted against it, which Evelyn had not predicted, and which she thought might have something to do with the fact that Atchison was in the room and Fitch was a man who understood which way certain winds were blowing. The 2 other no votes were men she'd never spoken to directly. The 2 yes votes were Dorsey's men. Dorsey left before the room fully dispersed. He didn't look at Evelyn on his way out. She watched him go and felt something she was careful not to mistake for relief, because relief implied it was over, and she knew enough about men like Calvin Dorsey to understand that losing a vote was not the same thing as being finished. But it was something. It was, for now, something. Outside in the cold, Hazel Brennan found her at the hitching post. 3-2, Hazel said. 3-2, Evelyn agreed. Hazel pulled her coat tighter. Her horse stamped once against the cold ground. Fitch surprised me. Me too. Atchison didn't surprise me. Hazel looked at her. You talked to him before the meeting. I went to report a potential theft, Evelyn said carefully. He drew his own conclusions. Hazel made a sound that might have been a laugh. Go home, Evelyn. Your birds are waiting. She drove back in the dark, Biscuit moving at his own comfortable pace on the road he knew, the sky overhead hard and clear and full of stars. She had the blanket across her lap and Noah's notebook in her coat pocket, and the cold coming up through the floorboards of the wagon. She was tired in the way you got tired when you'd been holding something tightly for a long time and had just been able to set it down. Not refreshed, just emptied out in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant. She thought about the vote, and she thought about Dorsey leaving without speaking, and she thought about Fitch's face when Atchison walked in. She thought about Tom Harkins saying I was wrong in a room full of people who'd heard him be wrong, and what it cost a man like Tom to say that, and what it meant that he'd said it anyway. She was nearly home, could see the dark shape of the house against the sky, when Millicent started. She heard it before she fully understood what she was hearing. The flock's alarm was different at night, louder somehow without the background noise of daytime, and Millicent's voice was distinct in it, that sustained directional honking that meant something was there, and it was close, and it was not moving away. Evelyn pulled Biscuit to a stop. She sat on the buckboard and listened, and she heard the alarm, and underneath the alarm she heard something else. A low orange light. Not the yellow of lamplight, something redder, something that flickered wrong against the horizon to the northeast. She tied Biscuit to the gatepost and ran to the flock first, because the flock was still going and she needed to understand the direction. Millicent was at the northeast corner of the fence, pressed against the rails, her alarm at full pitch, her attention fixed on the horizon with the absolute certainty of something that had no doubt about what it was sensing. Fire. It was the Dunmore granary. She placed it after a moment. The Dunmore claimed 3/4 of a mile northeast. The Dunmores had gone to visit family for the week. She'd known that, the way you knew things about people near you. The granary held the winter grain stores. She did not think. She unhitched Biscuit, got up on him bareback, which she hadn't done in years and which Biscuit objected to with a sideways step she ignored, and she rode for the nearest neighbor, the Harkins place, because they were the closest and Tom was the most practically useful person she could bring. She was hammering on the Harkins' door within minutes. Tom answered in his long underwear with a lamp, and she told him and watched his face do the fast calculation, and he yelled something back into the house and was pulling on boots before she finished talking. Ruth appeared at the door. How bad? I don't know. I just saw the light. I'll get the Caldwells, Ruth said, already moving. She had the decisive efficiency of a woman who'd thought about emergencies and knew her role in them. Tom and Evelyn rode northeast together, and the light was bigger when they got there. The granary fully involved, the fire eating through the dry winter stores with the particular appetite of something that had been burning for longer than they'd like. But the house was not yet touched, and the wind was coming from the west, which meant they had a chance. What they also had by the time they arrived was the sound. The sound was the geese. Her geese. 39 birds at a 3/4 mile distance. their alarm carrying across the flat prairie in the cold, still air with a clarity that cut through the dark like a bell. And because the prairie was flat and the night was still and the alarm had been going for several minutes before Evelyn reached the first neighbors, the houses in the valley were waking up. She didn't plan it. She hadn't organized it. It was simply what the flock did. They alarmed, the sound traveled, the sound said something is wrong in a language that didn't require translation, and the people of the valley responded to it the way people respond to alarm when the alarm is credible and loud and doesn't stop. By the time Tom and Evelyn reached the Dunmore property, 3 other wagons were already on the road. By the time they got water moving, the Dunmore well, a bucket line that Tom organized with the fast economy of a man who understood fire, there were 11 people working the line and 2 more arriving. The granary was lost. There was no saving the granary. But the house stood and the livestock survived, and the 2 men who'd started the fire, who Evelyn recognized with a cold certainty that settled in her chest as the same 2 men she'd intercepted at her south fence 5 days ago, ran when the wagons arrived and were run down by Dale Atchison and his deputy before they reached the road to the east. She found out later that Atchison had been heading home from the council meeting when he heard the geese. He'd been on the road, not a quarter mile from her property, and the alarm had made him stop his horse and look at the horizon, and he'd seen the light. He'd said it to Tom, who told Ruth, who told Evelyn 2 days later. I heard those birds, and I knew something was wrong. That sound didn't leave room for a mistake. The days after the fire were the kind of days that rearranged things. Not loudly. The prairie didn't do things loudly, mostly. But the arrangement shifted, the way furniture shifts in a room when someone moves one large piece and everything else finds a new position. The story of the geese and the fire spread with the particular speed of something that was both dramatic and verifiable, which made it stick in a way that gossip usually didn't. People who'd been at the council meeting 2 nights before and had voted, or nearly voted, to remove the flock, were now sitting with that knowledge in a way that was probably not comfortable. Evelyn didn't say anything about it. She didn't call on people. She didn't send word around. She went home and she checked the flock and she fed them their morning grain, and she stood in the cold yard and looked at the birds doing their perimeter walk, Millicent at the front with her crooked neck tilted at the pale January sky, the ganders at the flanks, the flock moving in the pattern she'd learned to read like a second language. Good work, she said quietly, to no one and everyone. Millicent turned and looked at her with the flat yellow eye that geese used for looking at things they'd already assessed and classified. Then the bird turned back to the fence line and went on watching. That was enough. Noah came the next morning earlier than ever, and he had his own notebook and also a second one. Newer, the pages still stiff. And he set them both on the kitchen table with an expression that was trying to stay calm and not entirely succeeding. I heard about the fire, he said. I figured you had. Millicent was alarming when I came past the south fence. He sat down across from her. What time did she start? Evelyn told him what she remembered of the sequence. The drive home, the sound, the orange light on the horizon. He wrote it down in the new notebook, carefully, in his tighter handwriting. When he finished, he looked up. This is going in the record, he said. All of it, the whole sequence. I know. People need to understand what actually happened. Noah. She looked at him across the table. He was 12 years old with a second notebook he'd bought himself, and the expression of someone who'd decided something. People already understand. That's the part you don't have to fix. He sat with that for a moment. The stove was going and the kitchen was warm, and outside the flock was doing their morning rounds in the cold January air. He looked down at the notebook. Okay, he said finally, but I'm still writing it down. I'd expect nothing less, she said, and got up to pour him coffee that was too strong for a 12-year-old and that he drank without complaint, because on the Kansas prairie, in January, you didn't turn down something hot, regardless of age. The second council meeting was not officially called a second council meeting. Gerald Fitch sent word around that there would be a community gathering at Pete Garland's store on the 15th of January, 1 week after the fire, to discuss the theft situation and what the county intended to do about it. The language was careful. Community gathering, not council session, not a vote. But everyone who received the message understood what it was, and everyone who'd been at the first meeting understood that the agenda had changed considerably since that night. Evelyn received her notice the same way everyone else did, through the informal network of the Prairie. Ruth Harkins stopped by on the 12th with the information, framed as neighborly update rather than official summons. She delivered it over coffee at the kitchen table with the slightly heightened energy of a woman who found herself in the middle of something significant and was not entirely unhappy about it. Fitch asked Tom specifically whether you'd be coming, Ruth said. Evelyn looked at her over the coffee cup. What did Tom say? He said he assumed you would. Ruth paused. Tom also said he'd told Fitch that the community gathering should include enough time for a real conversation, and that Fitch had agreed to that. She set down her cup. I think Gerald Fitch is trying to find a way to land somewhere other than where he was standing 2 weeks ago. He voted against the ordinance. He did. But he also called the meeting that put the ordinance forward, and the people in this county have long memories for that kind of thing. Ruth looked at her hands. He's trying to put some distance between himself and Dorsey. Evelyn considered this. That's his problem to manage. It is. But it might also be useful to you. Ruth looked up. If Fitch is looking to rehabilitate his standing, he's going to want to be publicly seen doing the right thing, which means the gathering might be more receptive than you'd expect. This was political calculation delivered in Ruth Harkins' voice, which meant it was delivered with a degree of discomfort because Ruth preferred to think of herself as a practical woman rather than a scheming one. The fact that she was offering it anyway said something about how clearly she now understood the situation. Thank you, Ruth, Evelyn said. That's useful. She spent the next 2 days thinking about Calvin Dorsey. Not obsessively. She had too much actual work for obsession. But in the background of everything else, the way you think about a problem that isn't solved yet. She'd told herself after the first meeting that losing a vote wasn't the same as being finished, and she'd meant it. Dorsey had operated in Harlan County for 20 years. He had debt leverage over half the established farmers and a relationship with the county assessor that hadn't gone away because he'd lost one ordinance vote. He was a man who thought in long timelines. He could absorb a setback. What she couldn't fully predict was what shape the next move would take. She'd stopped him on the flock. She'd stopped him, arguably, on the theft operation. She'd never proven a direct connection between Dorsey and the two men, and she wasn't sure she could. But the implication in the county's understanding was clear enough. Whether Dale Atchison had found anything connecting Dorsey to that operation was something she didn't know. She thought about asking Atchison directly. She decided against it. There was a point at which pursuing something became the kind of thing that turned you into a different person than you wanted to be. And Evelyn was aware of that line even when she couldn't see it clearly. What she could do was go to the meeting and say what was true. That had worked once. She would try it again. Noah came the morning of the 15th with his 2 notebooks and a third item she hadn't seen before. A carefully drawn map on a large piece of paper that showed the Mercer property, the surrounding claims, and a series of dates and events marked at the relevant locations. He'd made it at home, working from the notebooks, and he'd drawn it with a precision that surprised her. The fence lines were accurate, the distances roughly correct, the chronology clear. He spread it on the kitchen table and looked at it critically. The October coyote is here, he said, pointing. The December cold front watch is here, January 5th here, and here's the direction they came from. He traced the line. And then the fire is here, northeast, with the alarm origin at the property line. Evelyn studied the map for a long moment. The whole sequence was visible at once when you laid it out spatially, not just a list of incidents, but a picture of a property that had been watched and protected, consistently, over 4 months. You made this last night, she said. Most of it. I had to redo the fence lines twice. He looked at it again with the slight dissatisfaction of someone who knows the approximations in their own work. The distances aren't exact. They're close enough. Close enough isn't exact. Noah. She looked at him. It's good work. Bring it. He folded it carefully and put it in his coat. The gathering at Pete Garland's store was larger than the first meeting. Evelyn noted that as she came in. More people, different people, families who hadn't been at the first meeting, farmers from further out on the county edges who'd heard about the fire and made the ride. The Dunmores were there, which she hadn't expected. She'd thought they were still at the family visit. They weren't. James Dunmore was a quiet man in his 50s who worked his land without complaint and had never in Evelyn's experience said more than 5 sentences at a stretch. He was standing near the front of the room with an expression that suggested he'd had 2 weeks to think about what had happened to his granary and had arrived at some conclusions. Calvin Dorsey was there too, further back than the first meeting, in a different position in the room. Still composed, still dressed well. But the room's relationship to him had shifted in the way rooms shift when the person who'd been organizing the furniture has had something taken out of their hands. Gerald Fitch opened things more carefully this time. He talked about the thefts, about the arrests, about what Atchison had been able to determine. He talked about the fire. He was deliberate, and he did not editorialize, which was itself a form of editorializing, because leaving out all editorial commentary on events that had a clear meaning was a way of letting the meaning stand without having to be responsible for it. Then James Dunmore stood up. He was not a man who stood up in rooms. Evelyn had genuinely never seen him do it. He stood with the slight awkwardness of someone who'd made a decision to do something difficult and was now committed to getting through it. "Those 2 men burned my granary," he said. 40% of my winter grain. My family came back to find the walls still standing and nothing inside them worth keeping." He stopped. He was looking at the floor, not at the room, which was how he managed to keep going. The same 2 men were tracked on the Mercer property 5 days before they came to mine, tracked by her geese, stopped by Mrs. Mercer and the Whitlock boy. He looked up. "I want to say that clearly, in front of everyone here, because I think it needs to be said clearly. Those birds gave warning that I did not hear in time. That's my loss. But the same birds gave warning on the night of the fire that got people to my property before the house burned too." His voice was steady, barely. "I owe a debt to that flock, and to the woman who keeps them. I wanted to say it here." He sat down. The room was quiet in the particular way it goes quiet when someone has said something true, and everyone knows it, and there's nothing to add. Then several more people spoke. Not in a rush, slowly, with the care of people who understood that what they said in a room like this would be remembered and associated with them permanently. The man named Olson, who'd mentioned his stolen tools at the first meeting, said he was now reasonably certain the same 2 men had taken them and that the timeline of their activities matched the pattern Atchison had been tracking. One of the Pelletiers, the younger son, late 20s, with the direct manner of someone who hadn't yet learned to be indirect, said that he'd laughed at the story of the geese when he first heard it in the fall and that he'd like to formally retract that, which drew a short, uncomfortable laugh from several people in the room. Hazel Brennan spoke. She made the practical case clearly and without sentiment. The flock had functioned as a community surveillance asset, the cost had been borne entirely by one farm, and the benefit had been distributed across the whole county. She used those specific words, community asset, distributed benefit, in the tone of a woman who'd thought about the framing carefully and was making an argument rather than an appeal. Tom Harkins said something similar but in Tom's way, which was less precise and more weighted. He'd been wrong, he said again, which was apparently something he needed to keep saying until it landed the way he needed it to. He said the county owed Mrs. Mercer an acknowledgement that the ordinance had been a mistake and that the complaint behind it had not represented the actual interests of the actual neighbors. He did not say Calvin Dorsey's name. Several people in the room looked toward the back, where Dorsey was standing, and then looked away, which was its own kind of saying it. Evelyn spoke when Fitch asked if she had anything to add. She stood up, and she had the list, and she had Noah's notebooks, and she had the map, and then she looked at the room and put all of it back in her pocket. "I came here with a lot of documentation," she said. "I've been keeping records since October. My helper has been keeping records since October. We have dates and times and specific incidents." She paused. "But I don't think I need to read any of it. I think everyone in this room already knows what happened. And I think what I actually want to say is simpler than anything in those notes." The room was watching her. "I bought 39 sick geese because I couldn't afford anything else. That's the truth of it. I didn't have a plan. I had an observation and a guess and very little money." She looked at her hands for a moment. "The birds did the rest. I watched them and I learned from them, and I had the good sense to trust what they were telling me. That's all I did." She looked up. "What I'd ask is that you let me keep doing it." She sat down. The vote on a formal resolution recognizing the geese as a legitimate farm operation and explicitly voiding the previous ordinance attempt passed 5-0. Fitch called the vote himself, without waiting for anyone else to suggest it. Dorsey left again before the room dispersed, again without speaking to her. This time, she let herself watch him go. He moved through the door with the same composure he always carried, and she studied his back as he went. The set of his shoulders, the controlled pace, the way he nodded once to Pete Garland at the door, as if this had all been a perfectly ordinary meeting about perfectly ordinary things. He was very good at it. 20 years of managing impressions had made him fluid in a way that looked like dignity from a distance. But she'd spent enough time reading the flock to understand direction, and the direction Calvin Dorsey was walking in, away from every person in this room, away from the acknowledgement that was happening whether he participated in it or not, told her something more honest than his composure. Dale Atchison caught her near the door as people were filing out. "The two men have been talking," he said, quietly enough that it was between them, "about who they were working for." Evelyn waited. I can't tell you where it leads yet. These things take time." He looked at her steadily. "But I want you to know that what you did in October, and November, and January, the documentation, the report, the details, it matters. These things need a foundation to stand on." "The boy's notebook," she said. Atchison nodded. "The boy's notebook, which is the most useful piece of evidence I've had in a two-county theft investigation, and which was compiled by a 12-year-old who was watching Geese for personal interest." He said it with the dry appreciation of a man who'd stopped being surprised by where useful things came from. "Tell him I said so." "He'll be more pleased about that than about anything else that's happened this month," Evelyn said. Atchison almost smiled. He put his hat on and went out into the cold. She found Noah waiting at the hitching post with her wagon, which he'd held with the straightforward protectiveness of a child who'd decided this was his contribution to the day's events. He had the map under his arm and both notebooks in his coat pockets, and the expression of someone who'd been waiting long enough to work himself up into wanting to know everything. "How'd it go?" he said. 5-0. He absorbed that. "And Dorsey? Left before the vote?" She untied Biscuit. "Atchison says the two men are talking about who employed them." Noah was quiet for a moment. "Do you think it leads to Dorsey?" "I think it might." "Do you think it matters if it does? Legally, I mean." She looked at him. He was asking a real question, not a child's question, the kind that wants reassurance, but an actual question about how the world worked, the kind that comes from paying attention for long enough to suspect the answer might be unsatisfying. "Maybe," she said honestly. "Legal accountability is a slow thing, and it doesn't always land where it belongs. But Dorsey's relationship to this county has changed. The people in that room know what they know. That doesn't go away because a court doesn't confirm it." Noah thought about this. "So the truth matters even when it doesn't do everything you want it to." "Yes?" "That's annoying," he said. "It is," she agreed. "It genuinely is." He handed her Biscuit's reins with the slightly reluctant expression of someone handing back a thing they'd been trusted with. She climbed up onto the buckboard, and he climbed up beside her, which he'd taken to doing on the longer drives without asking, and she'd stopped not offering the seat. The road out of Colby was frozen hard, and the wagon made a clean sound over it, and the sky was the particular blue of January at mid-afternoon, cold and high and without clouds. Evelyn drove and didn't talk much, and Noah rode beside her with his map on his knee, looking at it with the expression of someone revising their understanding of something they'd drawn. After a while he said, "I want to add the community gathering to the record. Both of them. As a single, I don't know what to call it, a single event maybe that has two parts." "What would you title it?" He thought. "The ordinance attempt and its failure," he said. Then, "No, that's too much about Dorsey." He thought again. "The flock's recognition," he said, more quietly. Evelyn considered that. The flock's recognition. Not her recognition. The flock's. 39 birds who'd done their work without any understanding of council votes or social standing or the particular way a county's opinion could shift in 2 weeks. They'd just done what they did. Watched the grass, tracked the dangers, sounded the alarm when the alarm needed sounding. "I like that," she said. Noah wrote it in the top margin of the map, carefully, in the handwriting that had gotten tighter over the months. They drove home through the cold afternoon, the prairie wide and flat and pale in every direction, and somewhere ahead of them the Mercer property sat in the January light with its 11 acres and its leaking roof and its 36 remaining geese, 3 lost to illness, 36 remaining, which was not nothing. Moving in their steady pattern around the fence line, Millicent at the south, the ganders at the flanks, the whole flock going about the work of watching the world that nobody had assigned them and that they did anyway, day after day, because that was what they were. The house came into view over the low rise, and Evelyn saw the flock from the road, just their movement, just the shapes of them in the distance, working the perimeter. She felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Not pride exactly, and not relief, though there was relief in it. Something more like the feeling of having put your weight on a thing you weren't sure would hold you, and having it hold. Biscuit picked up the pace as the barn came closer. He always did. She let him. February came in quieter than January, which was not the same thing as calm. The county had the particular atmosphere of a place that had been through something significant and was still deciding what to do with it. People talked about the fire and the arrests with the slightly heightened energy of a community that had been reminded of its own vulnerability and was processing that reminder in the way people process most uncomfortable things. By talking about it until it became story, and by story became manageable, and by manageable became the kind of thing you could put on a shelf and live alongside. The 2 men were in the county jail awaiting trial. Dale Atchison had made 2 more trips to speak with them, and each time he'd come back with a slightly different expression than when he'd left, the expression of someone assembling something piece by piece and watching the shape of it emerge. Calvin Dorsey was still in Harlan County. That was the thing people asked Evelyn about, in the careful way they asked things they were genuinely uncertain about, whether she was worried, whether she thought he'd try something else. Ruth Harkins asked it most directly on a February morning when she came by with a jar of apple butter and the pretext of checking on the flock. "He's still holding your note," Ruth said. "He is," Evelyn said. "March payment." "I know when my payment is, Ruth." Ruth set down the apple butter with the slight embarrassment of someone who's been tactless in an attempt to be helpful. "I'm not trying to... I just think you should know that Tom has been talking to some people about whether there's a way to... Tom doesn't need to do that." "Evelyn, I'm going to make the March payment." She said it without the particular defiance that would have made it bravado, just a statement. "I've been running the numbers. The fall production was better than the last 3 years combined. The note is manageable if the spring is decent." Ruth looked at her for a moment. "And if the spring isn't decent, then I'll deal with the spring that is." She picked up the apple butter. "Thank you for this. Sit down and I'll make coffee." She had, in fact, been running the numbers carefully. The fall production had been better. The geese's work in the garden rows had made a real difference, one that was visible in the inventory and in what she'd been able to sell at the Colby market in November. She'd kept the numbers honest, not optimistic, because optimistic numbers were a way of lying to yourself, and she'd watched Daniel do it for 6 years and understood what it cost. The March payment was tight, but possible. The September payment was further out and would require a good spring and a careful summer. What had changed, what she was still adjusting to, was that the farm no longer felt like something she was losing. It had felt that way for the entire 14 months since Daniel died. The constant low-level sensation of water coming in through the hull, of bailing faster than the leak and not being entirely sure which one was winning. That sensation had not fully disappeared, but it had changed quality. The farm felt now like something she was building, which was different from surviving, different in a way she found difficult to articulate, but that she felt in the difference between lying awake at night planning how to stop something from failing versus lying awake at night thinking about what to do next. Those were different kinds of wakefulness. One of them was fear. The other was something else. Sick. The first serious inquiry came in February from a farmer named Calder, who ran a claim 15 miles north and who had heard the story of the geese through the network of people who'd heard the story of the geese, which by this point covered most of Harlan County and had apparently begun spreading into the adjacent ones. He rode to her property on a Tuesday morning, introduced himself at the gate with the slight awkwardness of someone who was embarrassed to be asking for something they'd previously considered ridiculous, and said that he had a predator problem on his eastern fence line that dogs hadn't solved, and that he'd like to understand more about what she was doing. She let him in and showed him the flock and explained what she knew. He watched Millicent work the perimeter with the expression of a man who'd expected to be skeptical and was finding it harder than anticipated. "She's the one that goes first," he said. "She has been from the beginning. I don't know if all flocks have one. Maybe they do. Maybe it's the individual bird. But yes, she reads things before the others." Calder looked at the flock for a long moment. "I lost 2 calves in the fall," he said. "Never found out how. The dog was useless." He paused. "I'm not saying it was the same situation as yours. I'm just saying. I know what you're saying." He looked at her directly. "Could you raise birds to sell? Train to work a property the way yours do?" She'd been thinking about this, not as a plan, not yet, but as a possibility she'd been turning over. "I don't know yet whether the training carries or whether it's something each flock develops on its own. I'd need more time to understand that. But you're thinking about it." "I'm thinking about it." He left without a commitment from either of them, but he left differently than he arrived, with the thoughtful, slightly unsettled expression of a man who'd gone looking for information and found more of it than he'd expected. She watched him ride north and thought about what he'd said, and thought about what Hazel Brennan had said months ago about the flock being a community asset, and thought about what it might mean to distribute that asset more deliberately. Basta. Noah was the one who pushed her toward it. He was 13 now. His birthday had been in January, and she'd given him a new notebook, which had seemed like the right thing, and he'd been coming to the property every day that weather and his family's needs allowed. His mother had apparently made some arrangement with Evelyn that Noah was not fully informed about, something involving Evelyn paying a small regular amount for his help that his mother accepted and his father did not know the details of, which was one of those quietly efficient solutions that women on the prairie developed when the official structures were insufficient. He had, by February, 4 notebooks, 4 careful records of the flock's behavior across every season he'd observed. He'd started organizing them into a kind of guide, not formally, not as a deliberate project, but in the way people sometimes discover they've been working towards something before they've named it. He showed her one afternoon in the kitchen, a section on reading the different alarm registers, a section on the flanking behavior of the ganders, a section on what Millicent's various postures indicated and how to distinguish them. "This is a manual," Evelyn said. "It's notes," Noah said. "Noah, this is a manual for training someone to understand a working flock." He looked at it with the slightly pained expression he used when someone said something accurate that he hadn't fully acknowledged to himself yet. "I was going to keep adding to it. Keep adding to it. But this is useful to someone who gets a flock from me and doesn't know what they're looking at." She looked at him. "You understand what I mean?" He did. She could see it in his face. The moment when a thing you've been doing for its own sake suddenly acquires a larger context, and you have to decide whether that changes your relationship to it. He was quiet for a moment. "You're actually going to do this," he said. "Sell birds." "I'm thinking about it seriously. And the manual would go with the birds." Something like that. He looked at the notebooks. "I'd need to reorganize it. The notes are in the order I observed things, not in the order someone new would need to learn them." He paused. "That'll take a while." "We have time," she said. "Do we?" He looked at her with the directness of a 13-year-old who'd been paying attention to adult anxiety for long enough to recognize it when he saw it. "Dorsey's note is in March." She looked at him for a moment. He held the look without backing down from it, which was something he'd gotten better at. "The March payment is covered," she said. "The September one needs a good spring." "Then we should probably start in spring," he said, "with the breeding program." She almost smiled. "Probably." Esquiched. March came, and she made the payment. She drove to Dorsey's store herself. She could have sent the payment through Pete Garland or through the bank, but she went herself, which was a decision she made without fully examining her reasons, and then examined afterward and understood. She went to the store, walked to the counter, and paid the note installment to Dorsey's clerk in the form of cash that she had earned from her own land. Dorsey was in the store. He was behind the counter at the far end, going over something in a ledger. He looked up when she came in, and then looked back at his ledger, and he did not come to the front of the store. His clerk handled the transaction with the professional neutrality of a man who understood that the atmosphere in the room had nothing to do with him. She took her receipt. She looked at Dorsey once, at the far end of the counter, still bent over his ledger with the deliberate attention of a man who is managing something with his posture. She left. Outside in the March cold, she stood for a moment on the board sidewalk. The sky was doing the thing it sometimes did in early March on the Kansas prairie. The light-changing quality, a warmth in it that wasn't quite warm yet, but was different from the flat cold of January, a suggestion of something coming. She could smell mud under the frozen ground, which was the specific smell of the season turning. She put the receipt in her coat pocket and untied Biscuit and went home. She heard about Dorsey's situation 3 weeks later from Atchison. He came to the property on a Tuesday afternoon, which was unusual enough to make her put down the fencing work and meet him at the gate. He had the expression of a man delivering information he'd been holding for a while, waiting until it was solid enough to be worth delivering. The 2 men in custody signed statements, he said, about who contracted them to work the county. Evelyn waited. It names Dorsey. Not directly. There's a layer between them, a man who handled the arrangements. But the layer leads back to Dorsey clearly enough that the county prosecutor is interested. Atchison looked at the flock, which was doing its morning perimeter walk behind her. It won't be fast. These things aren't fast. He has lawyers, and he has resources, and he'll use both. But the county assessor has also been asked to produce certain records regarding property assessments over the last several years, and that's a separate matter that has its own timeline. Evelyn thought about the farmers who'd lost tools in October and grain in November, and who'd been struggling with note payments on land whose assessments had been creeping upward for years. She thought about all the ways a man could arrange things without ever doing anything that looked wrong from the outside. "Does he know?" she said. "That the investigation is open?" "Yes, he knows. And he's still here. He's still here. Men like that, they believe in their own management of situations until the situation is no longer manageable." Atchison looked at her. "I wanted you to know the status, what you built here, the records, the timeline, the pattern. It gave us a map of the activity that we didn't have before. That matters in this kind of case." "Noah's notebooks," she said for the second time. "Noah's notebooks," he confirmed, and this time he did smile briefly before putting his hat back on and riding out. Spring came the way it always came on the Kansas prairie. Not gently, not gracefully, but with the abruptness of a season that had been held back too long and was making up for it all at once. The mud came first, deep and indiscriminate. Then the grass, which greened up from the brown faster than it seemed it had any right to, and then the wildflowers in the low ground, and then the particular blue sky of April that had a depth to it that January's cold blue didn't, a warmth in the color that changed everything it touched. Evelyn started the breeding program in April. She did it carefully, the way she did most things, not the way someone follows a plan, but the way someone follows their own best judgment, which is slower and requires more adjustment, but tends to produce something that actually fits the specific situation. She'd separated out the birds with the strongest alarm responses and the clearest flanking behavior. She'd watched the offspring of the original flock through the winter and identified which among the younger birds showed the alert stillness that Millicent had always had. That particular quality of attention, the capacity to watch something for a long time without reacting, which was different from mere wariness and which she'd come to understand as the core of what made a bird genuinely useful. Millicent herself was now something close to a legend on the property. She was 3 years old, which was not old for a goose, but which represented 3 years of developing whatever it was she'd always had, and she'd gotten better at it rather than worse. She watched the world with the patient certainty of an animal that has never had its instincts ignored long enough to doubt them. Evelyn watched her sometimes in the early morning when the light was still low and the prairie was at its quietest, and she thought about what it meant to trust a thing you didn't fully understand. She'd bought 39 sick birds because she'd noticed something and followed the noticing, which was not a plan and not a strategy and not the kind of thing you could put in a ledger under sound investment. It was just paying attention and taking seriously what you saw. That was all it had ever been. And she thought there was something in that worth holding on to, something that had nothing specifically to do with geese. Calder bought the first birds in May, 6 birds from the spring offspring, 2 of them showing the alert posture that suggested they'd inherited something useful. Noah spent an afternoon at Calder's property walking him through the notebook entries, explaining what to look for, how to distinguish the different alarm registers, how to read the flanking behavior of the ganders. Calder listened with the focused attention of a man who'd stopped being embarrassed about not knowing something and had moved into genuine learning. "The one with the darker bill," Noah said, pointing at one of the 6. "Watch her specifically. She's been responding first in the group since January." Calder looked at the bird. "She have a name?" Noah glanced at Evelyn. "Not yet." "Every farm is different," Evelyn said. "She'll develop her own patterns here. Give her time." Calder nodded. He was quiet for a moment, watching the birds settle into their new space. Then he said, without looking at either of them, "I heard the Dunmore place is doing better, since the granary situation." "James Dunmore rebuilt," Evelyn said. "He got help from a few families." "He told me." Calder was still watching the birds. "He told me he was thinking about geese for the spring, and the pelletiers." He paused. "I think there are going to be more people asking." "I think so too," Evelyn said. There were more people asking. By the end of May, she'd placed 2 more flocks, the pelletiers and a family named Greer, who ran a claim on the county's western edge and had been losing chickens to something they couldn't identify. By June, there were 4 more inquiries, from claims further out, people who'd heard the story at the Colby market, or from a neighbor who'd heard it from a neighbor. The story had acquired the particular momentum of something that was demonstrably useful, not just interesting, not just unusual, but useful in the specific practical way that mattered to people who worked the land for their survival. Noah was spending full days at the property by June. His mother had made the arrangement formal. Evelyn paid a weekly wage that was honest rather than generous, which was the appropriate amount for work that was also training, and which Noah's mother used to manage the family's ledger in ways that compensated for the directions it was being pulled in. His father was around less than he'd been. That was a complicated fact that nobody discussed directly. Noah handled it the way he handled most difficult things, by working and by writing things down and by being somewhere useful when being useful was possible. He was good at it now. Not just the geese, not just the observation, but the work itself. The practical management of a breeding operation, the timing of the feeding cycles, the assessment of which offspring to keep and which to sell and which were something in between. He had opinions. He expressed them. He was wrong about things sometimes, in the specific ways that come from having learned something mostly through experience rather than instruction. And when he was wrong, she told him why without making it larger than it needed to be, and he adjusted. That was its own kind of education. The kind that doesn't have a name. In August, the county prosecutor's office announced formal charges against Calvin Dorsey. The charges covered 3 things: fraudulent coordination of the theft operation, bribery of a county official related to the property assessment irregularities, and something more technical that Evelyn didn't fully understand but that Atchison explained had to do with the manipulation of lending terms in a way that crossed the legal line the terms had always walked close to. He posted his own bond. He retained 2 lawyers from Topeka. He was not in jail, and it was not certain he would be. Atchison had said that clearly, and Evelyn respected the clarity. Men with lawyers from Topeka had options that other men didn't. The case would take the time it took, and would end the way it ended, and she had learned enough about the limits of formal justice to hold the outcome loosely. What was less loose, what was less dependent on the outcome of a trial, was what had already happened in Harlan County. Dorsey's lending operation had lost most of its client base in 6 months, not because of the charges, but before them, because the county's understanding of him had shifted and people had begun finding other arrangements for their financial needs, the way water finds different channels when the main one is blocked. His store was still operating, but the particular authority he'd had, the authority of someone everyone needed, had gone out of it in the way it does when people discover they need someone less than they thought. That kind of authority, Evelyn had come to understand, was always more fragile than it looked. It depended entirely on people believing they had no alternative. Give them an alternative, show them one was possible, even a hard and uncertain one, and the whole arrangement lost its grip. She thought about that sometimes, about what it meant, and what it cost, and what it required. It required someone to go first, someone who had enough desperation or enough stubbornness or enough inability to see the situation as fixed to try the thing that looked unreasonable to everyone else. Someone who'd spend their last $30 on 39 sick birds because the reasonable options had run out. She didn't flatter herself that she'd planned any of this. She hadn't. She'd observed something, she'd trusted it, she'd worked hard, and she'd had help from a 12-year-old boy who kept notebooks and a flock of birds that didn't know anything about county politics and had simply kept watching the grass because that was what they did. The lesson in that, if there was a lesson, was not comfortable. It was not the lesson of the person who formulates the brilliant plan and executes it. It was something harder and more specific. That the thing you need is usually already there in a form you didn't expect, and that most of the work is learning to see it clearly enough to trust it. That the world offers you information constantly, and the question is only whether you're paying attention to the right things and honest enough to act on what you find. Evelyn had not always been good at that. She'd been afraid, after Daniel died, in ways she hadn't fully acknowledged to herself. Not afraid of physical danger, the Prairie had calibrated that fear into a practical tool, but afraid of the particular kind of failure that meant being seen to have tried and come up short, of being the widow who couldn't hold the claim, of confirming what she'd seen in Tom Harkin's arithmetic eyes and Agnes Caldwell's careful social distance. That fear had almost made her buy the guard dog. She was glad she hadn't. September came, and she made the second note payment. And then October, and the flock's first anniversary on the property, which was not a thing she marked formally, but which she was aware of. The morning of the day she'd brought them home, she went out to the yard in the early light and stood with the flock moving around her, Millicent at her usual position, the ganders at the flanks, the younger birds from the spring breeding working their way into the formation's logic. The way all young things worked their way into things, through trial and repetition and gradual understanding. Noah found her there. He came through the gate with his current notebook, the sixth now, thick with a year's worth of entries, and stood beside her without saying anything for a while, which was something he'd gotten comfortable with, the silence between them that didn't need filling. 1 year, he said eventually. 1 year. He looked at the flock. Millicent had noticed him and done her brief assessment and returned to her fence line, which was Millicent's version of an acknowledgement. My mother asked me last week what I want to do. When I'm older, what kind of work? Evelyn waited. I didn't know what to say. He was looking at the birds, not at her. I didn't know a year ago that this was something that existed, this kind of work. Watching things carefully and writing down what you see and using that to help people protect what they've built. He paused. It seems like it could be a lot of different things, not just geese. It could be, she said. Atchison said something like that when I brought him the notebooks in January. Noah opened his current notebook to no particular page, just held it. He said the most useful thing in an investigation was usually someone who'd been watching something carefully before anyone knew there was something to watch for. Evelyn thought about that, about the months before anything happened, when the flock was just 36 birds on 11 acres that nobody cared about. And Noah was just a boy at the fence line with serious eyes and a notebook he'd started keeping for his own reasons. All that patient watching before there was any reason to think it would matter. You were already doing it, she said, before you knew it would be useful. I just wanted to understand them. That's why it worked. He was quiet for a moment. The prairie was doing its October thing, the grass going brown at the edges, the light coming lower and more golden across the flat land. The air carrying the particular combination of harvest and cold that meant the season was shifting. Somewhere to the north, a new family on a claim was learning to read a flock they'd bought in June, working through the notebook Noah had written and rewritten until it said clearly what it meant. Somewhere across the valley, on a dozen properties that hadn't had this kind of watching before, geese were working fence lines and alarming at movements in the grass and doing the wordless, continuous work of paying attention that was the only thing Evelyn had ever asked of them. What are you going to tell your mother? Evelyn said. About what you want to do. Noah thought about it seriously in the way he thought about everything. I'm going to tell her I'm already doing it, he said, and that I'm going to keep doing it and get better at it and see where it goes. Evelyn nodded. That was, she thought, about as honest an answer as a person could give to that question. It was the answer she would have given herself a year ago if someone had asked her what her plan was. Not a plan exactly. A direction. A practice. Something you did every day until the doing of it made you into the person who could do it. The flock moved through the yard in the October light, and Millicent stood at the south fence with her crooked neck tilted at the horizon, watching something in the grass that nobody else could see yet, patient and certain and entirely without doubt. And across the Harlan County prairie, in the valley that had learned to listen for a particular sound, the morning was as quiet as mornings get, which was not very quiet at all for those who knew how to hear it.